The stars above the massive alien ship shimmered in the cold expanse of space. Commander Jackson Raynor stood at the center of the bridge aboard the Aegis, watching the glowing lights of distant galaxies flicker across the viewports. The crew was silent as they drifted through the unknown, their mission simple: to explore uncharted space and establish peaceful contact with alien civilizations. Jackson had always believed that diplomacy, not violence, would be the key to humanity's future in the galaxy. But that belief was about to be tested. "Commander, we've received a transmission from the Correction Warfleet," the communications officer, Lieutenant Sari Vega, said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but Jackson could hear the underlying tension. The Corrections were known throughout the galaxy as a proud, warrior-driven race, feared for their brutal combat skills and unwavering strength. No one had ever dared to challenge them, until now. Jackson's fingers hovered over the console as he read the message. The Corrections were calling for combat. Specifically, the Correction warrior leader, Taliex, demanded a duel. She was one of the fiercest fighters in her fleet, known for her exceptional battle skills and indomitable spirit. The message was clear. She wanted a one-on-one challenge with Jackson himself. "What's the meaning of this?" Jackson muttered, barely able to believe the words before him. He glanced around the room, his crew waiting for his orders. The Corrections were notorious for their pride, and Jackson knew that they were not asking for a duel lightly. This was a test of strength and honor, one that could determine the fate of their peaceful negotiations, or worse, escalate into war. "Commander," Lieutenant Vega continued, "the Corrections have made it clear. If we refuse the challenge, it will be seen as a sign of weakness. They expect us to either prove our strength or leave their space immediately." Jackson clenched his jaw. He wasn't the type to seek out confrontation, especially with a species as powerful as the Corrections. But refusing their challenge could ignite hostility that might not be easy to contain. Still, accepting it meant stepping into an arena where defeat could have catastrophic consequences. It wasn't just about his pride. It was about the future of humanity in this galaxy. "I'll accept," Jackson finally said, his voice steady and resolute. The crew exchanged looks of surprise, but no one spoke out of turn. They all understood the gravity of the situation. The stakes were high, too high, in fact, for Jackson to back down now. He wasn't about to let his people be seen as weak, especially not by the Corrections. The room fell silent as Jackson looked toward the massive holographic display, showing Taliex's warship hovering ominously in the distance. He could almost feel her gaze, sharp and unyielding, as if she were already watching him. It was clear that this battle would be no ordinary fight. The Corrections had underestimated humanity for too long, and Jackson knew it was time to prove them wrong. With a deep breath, he turned to his crew. "Prepare for the duel. We fight to show them that humans are not to be underestimated." The Aegis was in motion, but the bridge was eerily quiet. Commander Jackson Raynor sat in the captain's chair, his gaze fixed on the holographic map of the star system. The Correction Warfleet was close, their massive ships hanging like shadows in the deep space. He could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. It wasn't just a matter of life or death for him. It was about the reputation of the human race. They were entering enemy territory, and this duel, against a warrior like Taliex, was unlike anything they had faced before. "Commander," Lieutenant Sari Vega's voice broke through the heavy silence. "We've received more details about the challenge. The Corrections want the duel to be hand-to-hand combat. No weapons, just strength and skill." Jackson clenched his fists. He was no stranger to combat, having undergone military training himself, but hand-to-hand combat with a Correction. He wasn't sure anyone could fully prepare for a fight like that. The Corrections were known for their battle-hardened warriors, and Taliex was considered a legend among them. Her name alone was enough to send shivers through the hearts of most who faced her. But Jackson wasn't like most people. He had learned early on that a strategic mind could sometimes triumph over brute force. It was time to put that to the test. "We'll need to prepare," Jackson said, his voice firm. He stood up and walked to the map on the console, tapping a few buttons to bring up a detailed analysis of the Coraxian tactics. The ship's sensors had been gathering data on their movements for the past few hours, but Jackson knew that no amount of information could predict how the duel would go. It was all down to instinct and strategy. Sari looked at Jackson, her eyes filled with concern. "Commander, this is no ordinary fight. Taliax is not just a warrior. She's a symbol of their power. If you lose, I know what's at stake." "Sari," Jackson interrupted, his tone serious. He met her eyes, letting her see the determination in his. "We're not just fighting for our lives. We're fighting for humanity's place in this galaxy. We have to show them we're more than just a species trying to survive. We're capable of standing our ground." Sari nodded, her worry still evident, but she respected Jackson's resolve. She turned to the rest of the bridge crew. "Prepare the crew for the duel. We'll need every advantage we can get." As Sari and the rest of the crew worked to make sure the Aegis was ready for what lay ahead, Jackson made his way to the training room. It was time to focus. His mind raced with possibilities, and he knew that in a few hours he would face Taliax in a fight that would define the future of humanity's relationship with the Coraxians. Inside the training room, Sergeant Elara Storm was waiting for him. A seasoned warrior in her own right, Elara had been by his side in countless skirmishes, though she was known for her quick reflexes and combat skills. Jackson had always known that her true strength lay in her mind. Elara wasn't just a fighter, she was a strategist, and right now, that's exactly what Jackson needed. "I've been running simulations," Elara said as she greeted Jackson. "I know the Coraxian fighting style. It's aggressive, focused on overpowering the opponent. But I've also found their weakness." Jackson raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what would that be?" Elara smiled. "Their pride. They rely too much on brute strength and intimidation. They underestimate adaptability. You need to outthink her, not outmuscle her." Jackson took a deep breath, letting the words sink in. "Then let's start preparing." He knew this wasn't just about the fight. It was about proving that humanity had more to offer than brute force. It was about strategy, resilience, and adaptability. And he was ready to show Taliax just. The tension in the air was palpable as the Aegis approached the designated arena, a vast empty space surrounded by the Coraxian fleet. The massive warships hovered in a tight formation, their ominous shapes casting long shadows across the battlefield. On the Aegis bridge, Commander Jackson Raynor stood, his posture straight, but his heart pounding in his chest. The moment of truth was upon him. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a statement to the entire galaxy that humanity wasn't a species to be underestimated. "Commander, we're entering the arena now," Lieutenant Sari Vega reported, her voice steady but her eyes betraying her nervousness. Jackson nodded, his gaze fixed on the holographic projection of the arena. The Coraxians had set up a designated area for the duel, a flat, barren patch of land on one of their moons. A neutral space, they had called it, where no weapons or external interference would be allowed. Just raw combat, one-on-one. "Taliax's ship is in position," Sari continued. "She's waiting for you." A part of Jackson wanted to stay on the bridge, to focus on the ship's systems, and leave the fighting to someone else. But he knew that wasn't possible. This was his challenge, his moment. He had to face it, and he had to do it alone. "I'm ready," Jackson replied, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. He turned to Sergeant Elara Storm, who had been with him every step of the way. "Elara, you know what to do. Keep the Aegis ready in case anything goes wrong." Elara nodded, her face a mask of resolve. "We're all behind you, Commander. You've got this." With one last look at his team, Jackson made his way to the transport pod that would take him to the battlefield. Inside, the pod was quiet, the low hum of the engines vibrating through his body. He didn't need to think about what would happen next. All he needed was to focus, to remember what Elara had taught him. The Coraxians were strong, Yes, but strength alone wouldn't win this battle. Strategy, speed, and adaptability were his greatest assets. When the pod landed on the arena's surface, the doors opened with a hiss, revealing the barren ground before him. Across from him stood Taliex, her towering figure bathed in the harsh light of the moon. She was everything Jackson had heard about and more. Her confidence radiated from her in waves, and her eyes locked onto his with the intensity of a predator sizing up its prey. Human. Taliex's voice rang out, deep and commanding. Are you ready to face me? Jackson took a deep breath, his heart steadying as he locked eyes with her. I'm ready, he replied, his voice unwavering. The crowd of Correction warriors roared in anticipation, the sound deafening in Jackson's ears. He could feel the weight of their gazes on him, could feel the pressure mounting with every passing second. But he didn't let it overwhelm him. He had faced challenges before, but this was different. This was about more than just survival. It was about proving to the Corrections, and to the galaxy, that humanity had a place among the stars. The ground beneath them trembled slightly as Taliex moved, her muscles rippling with power. She was fast, faster than Jackson had anticipated. She closed the distance between them in the blink of an eye, launching herself at him with a speed that took him off guard. But Jackson was prepared. He sidestepped, narrowly avoiding her strike, and immediately countered with a quick jab aimed at her side. Taliex grunted in frustration, shifting her weight to block the blow. She wasn't used to an opponent who could keep up with her. But Jackson wasn't here to match her strength. He was here to outsmart her. The duel continued, a flurry of fast-paced movements, with each fighter using their skill to gain the upper hand. Jackson's agility and quick thinking kept him one step ahead, but it was clear that Taliex wasn't going to make it easy. Every time he thought he had an advantage, she would counter with a move he hadn't anticipated, showing just how dangerous she truly was. But Jackson was starting to see the cracks. Taliex's confidence was her strength, but it was also her weakness. She relied too much on brute force, too much on overwhelming her opponents, and that was something Jackson could use to his advantage. The battle raged on, with the ground shaking beneath their feet as the two warriors clashed in the center of the arena. Jackson Raynor's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline pumping through his veins. Every move he made was calculated, every step purposeful. He was focused, moving with a precision that surprised even him. He had trained for this moment, prepared himself for the inevitable fight, but nothing could have fully prepared him for the ferocity of Taliex. The Correction warrior was relentless. Her strikes were powerful, and her speed was a testament to her race's natural combat prowess. Her massive fists aimed to crush Jackson with each blow, but he was quick, dodging and weaving between the heavy punches. Taliex growled in frustration as her attacks continued to miss, but she showed no sign of slowing down. Every failed strike only seemed to fuel her anger, pushing her to fight harder, faster. Jackson's mind was sharp. He could see the patterns in her movements, the slight hesitation before each attack, the way her muscles tensed just before she struck. And in those moments, he found the openings he needed. With a calculated twist, he sidestepped one of her lunges, his fist connecting with her side. Taliex staggered back, her eyes flashing with disbelief. This human, this weak human, was landing hits, something that shouldn't have been possible. For a moment, Taliex faltered. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile what she was experiencing. The humans were supposed to be fragile, easy to break under the pressure of a warrior like her. Yet, Jackson had been avoiding her every attack, using his speed to counter her strength. This wasn't supposed to happen. Her reputation, her strength, everything she had based her identity on was being challenged by someone she had underestimated, and it shook her to her core. Taliex paused, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Jackson didn't stop. He circled her, every muscle in his body coiled, waiting for the right moment to strike again. His mind was focused, calculating each move, each step. But Taliex was struggling with something deeper. The realization that this fight wasn't as one-sided as she had thought, that she might not be the unstoppable force she believed herself to be. She looked at Jackson, his eyes unwavering, his posture unbroken, and something stirred within her, a flicker of respect. Perhaps, or maybe it was frustration. She wasn't sure, but the human before her was unlike any opponent she had ever faced, and that was beginning to scare her. With a guttural roar, Taliax launched herself at Jackson again, her fists aiming for his head. She moved faster than before, but this time, Jackson was ready. He darted to the side, ducking under her swing, and with surprising agility, twisted her arm, using her momentum against her. Taliax grunted in surprise, her body crashing to the ground as Jackson skillfully pinned her to the dirt. For a moment, there was silence. Taliax's chest heaved as she tried to process what had just happened. She had been defeated in such an unexpected way that she didn't know how to respond. For the first time in her life, she realized she was up against something more than just strength. Jackson wasn't like the other warriors she had faced. He was different, and that difference was throwing her off balance. Jackson didn't push his advantage. Instead, he waited for her to regain her footing, standing tall but ready to continue the fight. The crowd watched in stunned silence, unsure of what would come next. Taliax, too, stood up, her expression no longer filled with anger alone. Now, there was something else, something that wasn't there before. Respect. A respect she had never expected to feel for a human. The arena was eerily silent, the only sound the heavy breathing of Taliax and Jackson Raynor. The fight had taken a strange turn. What was meant to be a straightforward battle of strength had evolved into something neither of them had expected. Jackson had landed blow after blow, and for the first time, Taliax was visibly shaken. Her powerful strikes were no longer finding their mark, and she had realized that her usual tactics wouldn't work on this human. Jackson wasn't just fast. He was smart, anticipating her moves and using her momentum against her. Taliax's pride burned inside her. She had never been so caught off guard in her life. The Correxian people were warriors, and their strength was unrivaled. But this human, this commander, had not only held his ground but had pushed her to her limits. She had been so sure of her victory, but now, a gnawing uncertainty lingered in the pit of her stomach. She was no longer sure who would walk away from this duel as the victor. Jackson stood just a few feet away, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his face. He had the upper hand, but he knew better than to get cocky. Every second in this arena was a reminder that anything could change. Taliax was a seasoned warrior, and she wasn't going to back down easily. But there was something different about her now, something more vulnerable than the indomitable force he had seen in her at the start of the fight. "Taliax," Jackson said, his voice steady but with a hint of curiosity. "Why fight like this? Why challenge me? You've got the strength to destroy me, but you're holding back. Why?" Taliax's eyes flared, a flash of surprise passing through them. No one had ever dared question her like this, especially not a human. But there was a flicker of something in Jackson's eyes, something that made her pause. "I'm a warrior," Taliax growled, her voice low. "It is my duty to prove our strength. We Correxians have fought for centuries, established ourselves as the most powerful race in this galaxy. And now you humans think you can just walk in and challenge us." Jackson nodded slowly, sensing that this wasn't just about the fight anymore. "I didn't come here to prove that humans are stronger. I came to show that we have something else, something you might not understand. We're adaptable. We're resilient. And most importantly, we fight smart." Taliax's grip on her fists tightened. "Resilience?" she scoffed. "I've crushed many, and none of them ever questioned their weakness. They just gave in." "I'm not like the others," Jackson said, his voice calm but firm. "We don't just fight with strength. We fight with our minds, with our will to survive. You may think we're weak because we don't fight like you do. But the truth is, our strength doesn't come from muscle. It comes from determination and intelligence." Teliak stood there, unmoving, her eyes narrowing as she processed his words. She had expected to defeat Jackson easily, but now something else was happening. He was challenging not just her strength, but the very foundation of everything she had been taught. Her entire identity as a warrior was built on the belief that strength was the ultimate measure of worth. And now, here was a human showing her that there was more to power than sheer force. The silence between them grew heavier. Taliak's mind raced, but for the first time, she wasn't sure what to do. Jackson had pushed her past the point of sheer combat. He had made her question the very essence of what it meant to be strong. This fight wasn't over, but the rules had changed. With a deep breath, Taliak lowered her fists slightly. "You're right," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is more to strength than what I've known." Jackson's eyes softened, but he didn't drop his guard. It's not about proving who's stronger. It's about understanding each other. And in that moment, Taliak realized that maybe, just maybe, this fight was about more than just victory. The dust in the arena settled, the echoes of their combat still lingering in the air. Jackson Raynor stood, sweat dripping down his face, his chest heaving with every breath. He had done it. He had held his ground against Taliak, the Karaxian warrior, and he wasn't sure what to feel. Relief, triumph, or something more complicated, something that went beyond just winning a fight. He had come into this duel with the intent to prove that humanity could stand its ground, but as the dust cleared and the arena grew quiet, he found himself reflecting on the unexpected connection that had begun to form between him and Taliak. Across from him, Taliak was still standing, though she was no longer charging at him with the same intensity. Her usual fierce demeanor had softened, her fists clenched at her sides as she caught her breath. The battle had taken a toll on both of them, and despite her earlier arrogance, there was no denying that she was shaken. Jackson had expected a different outcome. He had thought that Taliak would either defeat him or force him to retreat in shame, but she hadn't. She had acknowledged his strength, in a way, and for that, Jackson was grateful. Taliak's gaze met his, and for the first time during the fight, she didn't look at him with the cold, dismissive eyes of a superior warrior. There was something else now, a grudging respect, perhaps, or an understanding that had only come to her through this brutal challenge. "You've surprised me, human," Taliak said, her voice softer than it had been during the fight. The words were unexpected, and Jackson couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. She had underestimated him from the start, just as she had underestimated the potential of his people. But now she was acknowledging him, not just as a fighter, but as an equal. "I didn't want to surprise you," Jackson replied, his voice steady. "I just wanted to show that we're not as weak as you think." Taliak let out a short, bitter laugh, rubbing a hand across her face. "I see that now." Her shoulders relaxed, the tension she had been carrying for so long easing just slightly. "It was foolish of me to think that brute force alone could determine the outcome of everything." Jackson raised an eyebrow, still processing the shift in Taliak's attitude. She wasn't backing down from her pride as a warrior, but she was no longer the same arrogant leader who had called for this duel. She had been forced to confront a truth she hadn't considered before, that strength could come from more than just sheer power. "Maybe," Jackson said, stepping a little closer, "but what you call weakness is what we call resilience. We fight smarter, adapt faster. We don't have the same physical strength, but we've learned to rely on what makes us different." Taliak looked at him for a long moment, the flicker of something unreadable passing through her eyes. Finally, she nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "Perhaps that's something we can learn from you." Jackson stood there, unsure of where to go from here. The crowd had fallen silent, watching the exchange between the two warriors, and for the first time, he realized that the fight wasn't just about proving who was stronger. It was about understanding one another. The Karaxians had called for a duel to test the strength of humans. But through the fight, they had both learned that strength was more than just physical power. It was the ability to adapt, to learn, and to change. And in that moment, both Jackson and Taliex understood that this battle wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much larger. The aftermath of the duel had left Jackson Raynor with more questions than answers. As he stood in the quiet, his thoughts wandered from the fight to the unexpected connection he had forged with Taliex. The Correction warrior leader had been relentless, full of pride and strength. But now, standing before him, she was different. She wasn't the fierce, untouchable figure she had been moments ago. Her respect, though grudging, had shifted something in him too, something he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about understanding. Taliex hadn't backed down, nor had she claimed victory. Instead, there was an unspoken recognition between them, something that neither of them had expected when this duel began. Jackson had fought for humanity's pride, but in the process, he had come to admire Taliex's strength, her unwillingness to quit, even when faced with someone who fought differently. He had seen a different side of her, a side that was more than just a warrior. As they stood across from each other, there was a silence between them that seemed to stretch out forever. The distant hum of the Aegis and the low murmur of the Correction crowd felt distant now. It was just the two of them, locked in a moment that neither could easily explain. Despite the exhaustion from the fight, Jackson felt a strange sense of connection with her, something beyond the respect of two warriors. He wasn't sure what it was, but it had nothing to do with victory or pride. It was something deeper. Taliex broke the silence first, her voice soft but firm. "You humans, I didn't think you could stand your ground, but you've shown me something today." Jackson met her gaze, his breath steadying as he processed her words. "I didn't want to prove anything to you. I just wanted to make sure humanity wasn't underestimated. We fight differently, but that doesn't make us weak." Taliex studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "I know. You're not weak. Not in the way I thought. I underestimated you, Jackson Raynor." Jackson could hear the weight of her admission, and in that moment, he realized just how much she had been holding on to her own beliefs. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a symbol of her people's pride, of their history. And yet here she was, acknowledging him, a human, as something more than an enemy, something more than an inferior species. "Maybe we both underestimated each other," Jackson replied, his voice quiet, his eyes never leaving hers. Taliex's lips quirked into a small, fleeting smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show that something had shifted between them. For a brief moment, Jackson wondered if this respect would be the beginning of a new relationship between their people. He wasn't naive enough to think it would be easy, but it was a step forward. The universe wasn't just about war and dominance. It was about finding common ground, no matter how unexpected it seemed. As the silence settled back around them, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just the end of a fight. This was the start of something far more complex, something that would change both of their worlds forever. And in that moment, he realized that perhaps their battle had been more than just a test of strength. It had been a test of something deeper: trust. The silence in the arena had stretched on long after the fight had ended, but now it was beginning to fade, replaced by a hum of cautious conversation. The Correction warriors, who had once expected a swift and decisive victory, now looked at Taliex and Jackson Raynor with a mix of disbelief and awe. The duel had ended in a way they hadn't expected, not with one of them lying in the dirt, but with both standing tall, having earned each other's respect. Taliex's eyes no longer glinted with the same arrogance that had marked their first meeting. Jackson had seen it. She was changed, and so was he. As the noise from the crowd slowly grew, Jackson found himself standing beside Taliex. Their gazes met briefly, and there was an understanding between them. Neither had expected to form a bond today, and neither had expected to leave the arena with their roles so drastically shifted. But here they were. The fight had not only proven humanity's strength, but also demonstrated something deeper: resilience, intelligence, and the power of adaptability. Jackson had known from the start that humans weren't just powerful in their fists. They were powerful in their minds, in their ability to adapt and learn. And now, Taliax knew it too. "We fought as warriors today," Taliax said, her voice steady, but softer than Jackson had ever heard it. She wasn't just speaking to him anymore. She was speaking to the galaxy. "But now we will fight as allies. I believe that together, our people can achieve far more than we ever could apart." Jackson took a deep breath. He had always known that the future of humanity would require diplomacy and understanding. But to hear Taliax, a leader of a race known for their warrior ethos, speak these words felt surreal. He had done it. He had changed the course of their relationship. He had shown her, and the galaxy, that humanity wasn't to be taken lightly. And now, the galaxy would see that humans could be allies, not just combatants. "You're right," Jackson said, his voice firm, but not without a hint of warmth. "We can achieve far more together than we ever could alone. The fight may be over, but the real work is just beginning. We've got a long road ahead, but I believe we can make it work." Taliax nodded, her gaze lingering on him with a mixture of respect and something else, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared moment. It wasn't the prideful stance of a warrior eager for dominance, but the silent understanding of two leaders who had just found a common purpose. The Correction warriors who had once seen Jackson as weak now looked at him with curiosity. Some whispered among themselves, their earlier doubts gone. The humans, it seemed, were not just a passing presence in the galaxy. They were here to stay, to grow, and to challenge the very way the universe worked. Jackson turned his gaze to the horizon, where the Aegis stood, waiting for his next move. There would be no going back. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Jackson felt that it held promise. He wasn't just a commander now. He was part of something much bigger. And with Taliax by his side, they could change the fate of their worlds. "Let's make sure we both live up to this," Jackson said with a grin. Taliax gave him a brief smile, a flicker of the warrior she once was returning. "We will," she replied, her voice strong and filled with a new kind of purpose. And for the first time, Jackson believed her. As the Aegis drifted slowly away from the Correction moon, the stars outside seemed to glow with a new intensity. Commander Jackson Raynor stood at the helm, his hands resting lightly on the controls. The weight of the past hours was beginning to settle in. The fight with Taliax was over, but something larger had begun. An alliance had been forged in the heat of battle, an unexpected partnership between two vastly different species. Jackson couldn't quite shake the feeling that today marked the start of something far bigger than he could fully comprehend. The Corrections, once seen as fierce enemies, were now allies, humanity's first step toward a place among the stars, not as outsiders, but as equals. "Taliax really surprised me." Sergeant Elara Storm's voice broke into Jackson's thoughts as she entered the bridge. Her eyes were sharp, but there was an underlying respect in them now, something Jackson had noticed in his crew ever since the duel. "I thought you were going to have to drag her off the battlefield." Jackson chuckled, his eyes still focused on the stars. "I thought she'd tear me apart, to be honest," he said, shaking his head. "But I think we both learned something today. We don't need to fight to prove who's stronger. There's more to power than just strength." Elara smiled. "I think she learned that too. The Corrections are proud, but they're not blind. They see the value of what we can offer. And, Commander, Taliax might not admit it, but I think she respects you now. We respect you." Jackson let out a long breath, the pressure finally starting to ease. He hadn't done this alone. He had his crew, his team. They had all stood together through everything, and now they had something to show for it. He hadn't just won the duel. He had earned their trust, not through brute force, but through the very thing that set humans apart: adaptability, resilience, and the willingness to change. As Elara took a seat next to him, Jackson noticed the transmission light flicker on. It was from Taliax's ship. Without hesitation, he tapped the button, and the image of the Correction warrior leader appeared before him. Her stance was no longer hostile or proud, but there was something else in her eyes, something that wasn't there before. "I've spoken to my people," Taliek said, her voice calm and steady. "They were wrong to underestimate you, human. They see now that you're more than just another race trying to survive. You've earned my respect, and I'll make sure the corrections remember that." Jackson felt a rush of pride at her words, but he didn't let it show. "And I'll make sure humanity keeps earning that respect. We've got a long road ahead, Taliek, but this is a good start." Taliek nodded, her eyes lingering on his. "Indeed, there is much to be done, but I believe we can accomplish it together." As the transmission ended and the communication panel blinked off, Jackson turned back to the stars. The vastness of space seemed smaller somehow, more approachable. The universe was no longer an uncertain expanse to fear. With the corrections by their side, humanity had just found its place in the galaxy. "This is just the beginning," Jackson said quietly, his voice filled with quiet determination. Ilara leaned back in her chair, a grin spreading across her face. "The beginning of what, Commander?" Jackson's gaze remained fixed on the stars. "The beginning of a new era."